Welcome to This Week in Local, a Localogy podcast featuring lively conversations about the local digital ecosystem, hosted by Localogy analysts Mike Boland and Charles Lachlan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Local. I'm Mike Boland, and my guest today is Brandon Grosvenor, who is Chief Revenue Officer of Torstar. So, Brandon, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be here, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we actually have a lot to get into, but let's start with a bit about your role at the company for context, as well as Torstar itself, sort of its product mix, and anything you can tell us about its operational scale.
Sure. So Torstar is the parent company of 6 daily newspapers, as well as over 25 community news sites and specialty sites, as well as the largest daily paid newspaper in Canada, the Toronto Star. So Torstar is the parent company of all of those brands, and obviously we're centered in Ontario, but Ontario within Canada is obviously the largest geographic footprint, and our reach is well over 30 million people.
Yeah, nice. Now, going deeper into some context, prior to Torstar, you've been in publishing for a while, but you also, within that sort of evolution, spent some time in the Yellow Pages. So tell us a little bit about what you've witnessed over that sort of career arc. Newspapers have obviously gone through several changes over the past few decades in their business models and their sort of place in society. So tell us your sort of view on the newspaper industry and the strengths that it has today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all part and parcel. And I have a very unique view. In Canada, we're going through some significant changes that other countries have gone through, notably France and Australia, around kind of the heavyweights and distribution. So for context, Meta and Google controlling 80 to 90%, depending on your jurisdiction, of internet traffic has caused, massive changes. And I think, we've been slow to adapt. The industry's been slow to adapt, and I think governance has been slow to adapt in terms of regulating the industry. And again, it depends on what side of the coin you land on, but I believe that a lot of the traditional and newspapers certainly can be put into this box. We're starting to see that with broadcasting, in terms of streaming, etc. And I would say directories and the Yellow Pages industry was probably the first to kind of go through this, where the business model was significantly disrupted, and that's not content based, but largely distribution based, and how people access information. And we're in really interesting times, just in the fact that, governments and jurisdictions are really trying to govern access and, pay for content, all of those type of things. The reality is that big media, the pivot point for all of us, is that we've lost control of the distribution of that content. And these working orders and these bills that are being passed are largely to try and get us, back to a space where we can be relevant. But the business model has been changed dramatically, and the fight, it's extremely interesting, and there's no answer as of yet as to kind of how we combat and work together to try and solve these industry issues. So largely newspapers are probably at the forefront of that change. Interesting to have worked in the directory business, where a lot of that content is commodity content. It's local businesses, hours of operation, directions, maps, listings, all of those things, which have largely become commoditized. And funny side note, I actually was one of the, and Yellow Pages directly, were probably the first to do a major deal with Google around Google Local and publishing those results, those search results. And little did we know at the time that, giving access to our full content library, they would find a way to to show that content in a much more usable, friendly way, thus kind of destroying the traffic and accessibility to the content through our own platform. So, live and learn, but we're all being disrupted. So, it started out with kind of the easy things to crawl on the internet, and those were the things that were displayed very quickly. Then it started to become, people starting to search for news, and that's where newspapers started to get interrupted, and a lot of that news was passed on free, disrupting the subscription model of newspapers, because we were still fighting for traffic so that we could, commercialize our websites and try and sell advertising. And now you're starting to see it through, YouTube and other players around streaming devices, around TV. So we're kind of all in the same bucket. It's just we're all at different levels of disruption from those major tech companies. I think a fair side note, and I apologize for being long-winded here, but
No, go on.
It's a pretty timely subject. I would say that, I don't believe that we're better off without these tech giants. I don't believe that there isn't a common ground to be found. It's just I don't believe that it's the position of the government to try and figure that out. We're all in a situation now where we have unique qualities, unique value propositions that we can bring to the table. We just need to find a way to kind of work together and bringing those to the forefront. And I think, you're starting to see that through a lot of the deals that, Google is coming to the table with in a lot of different jurisdictions. Meta has been a little bit tougher to deal with, I would say, a little more standoffish, at least around kind of news. But
Yep.
there is a model there. We're just we're not there yet in terms of how that works to support the industry.
Mm-hmm. So despite those challenges, despite the disruption, whether it be content-based disruption or distribution-based disruption, as you rightly delineated, where are the areas of differentiation that you believe exist? So, for example, you mentioned the key word, which is commoditization, which sort of plagued a lot of the directory publishers. But it would seem that newspapers have a lot of sort of commoditization-proof areas to sort of make up a term. If you look at the uniqueness of things such as hyper-local content, the reporting, different sort of topical or departmental areas such as, sports and politics, what are the opportunities to lean into those differentiators?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. I think here's the challenge, and I think I'm going to age myself here, but the reality is if you're under 30 years old, you've probably never paid for a subscription to, a news-based product. Information has been at your fingertips, whether you're on X, following news feeds, whether you're, getting your limited news on Insta or Facebook, or, very, very primitively now, you're typing into your search engine, any news topic. The reality is news has always been readily available, and it has been commoditized, and that's that is not on the tech giants. That is on us for making it available. The challenge has been that there is no content being produced by the folks that are amplifying it, and if you kind of think of that at its core, it's the distribution has been disrupted because you're entering not through the front door, which is the URL to any news source or any directory source or any information source. You're going through a side door, which is essentially search or social, where you're being pushed into here's 10 stories on what you're looking for. So you kind of go back and you've got to you asked the great question is how do we evolve? How do we make sure that news is still relevant? I think the biggest worry, and I'm a father. My biggest worry is that my child starts to get cut off of reputable journalism, fact-based news, and what she's starting to receive is propaganda, is someone's opinion on the news, because she's going to be unwilling to pay for a subscription. So I think the balance in this is how do we work on a distribution deal with, those companies now that have that excessive reach and make sure there's a deal that's favorable for both, where we do what we do best, and that's produce, award-winning content, and they do what that they do best, which is accessibility and ease of use. Because we still believe we have a premium product, we still have a very strong subscriber base, but that subscriber base compared to the scale of, whether it's our city, our province or state, or our country, is dwarfed by, the amount of users and scale that those tech giants carry.
Yeah, and now would seem to be the right time to re-engineer those content distribution relationships. Like you said, you bring the strengths to the table of the content production, and they have the distribution. It would seem that the pendulum is sort of swinging back towards, at least to some degree, a willingness to pay for content. And we've seen that, just happen as a byproduct of a lot of the stuff happening in the privacy world, where the sort of unchecked era of ad tech with all this free content led to some bad things. So I think that you're starting to see, as a result of that, I will pay for content with my dollars instead of my data, or at least some degree of willingness for that type of attitude. And things are just sort of swinging back in that direction. And you look at some sort of premium content publishers, such as the New York Times and the Economist and the Wall Street Journal and others, that are actually, doing quite well with their digital subscriptions. So what do you look at in terms of the macro environment with some of that privacy stuff, that willingness, and then also some of those models out there that have done well with their digital subscriptions?
Yeah, so I mean, it's again there, and you mentioned the New York Times, the Economist. The advantage they have is obviously national recognizable brands.
Sure.
However, we all have a space. I mean, I mentioned off the top, obviously the publisher, the Toronto Star, which is also a national brand here in Canada, and I think the I think the innovation that is coming to the table, or has come to the table in the last, call it 3 to 5 years, has been a something that's given us great hope. And I would say, in the past, the way we would go to market, or the way that most news publishers would go to market, would be, subscription is first. Most people think that newspapers derive most of their revenue through advertising. The reality is the larger newspapers derive most of their revenue through subscription, because it is seen as a premium product. Typically, an older audience, just the fact that have grown up with the brand, or rely on the brand for reputable journalism. There are new models now that are reaching out to a younger subscriber. So we're hoping in Canada we're going to be the first to market with micro subscriptions, which is not necessarily a new model, but it's essentially an iTunes model for newspapers, whereby you might not subscribe on a monthly basis or an annual basis, but you may hit a paywall, for instance, on something that is very important to you, and you may pay 30 cents or $1 to read that article. And that, to us, is the best way to gain new subscribers, because as you start to get more familiarized with the brand, with the authenticity of the article, you may be more susceptible, as you realize you're consuming 3 to 10 to 20 articles a month, to start to say, okay, listen, I'm gonna subscribe, and really a great pull metric from a marketing perspective for us. The other portion of this that no one has really landed on the perfect model. I would say the New York Times is probably the gold standard, but is offering value back. So you subscribe to a newspaper, but you might not subscribe to the whole newspaper. You might go into, for instance, the New York Times has made a significant investment within their games and puzzles. And you have, a notable amount of people that just subscribe to the Saturday Times to spend an hour or 2 hours with that part of the publication. So a lot of these things are things that we're all kind of testing, and we're all working with. That, I guess, at the base level, our survival and our return to significant profitability is really based on figuring out the distribution model, and not being all things to all people. And again, it's been a challenge. It's interesting, you talk about the directory business. I guess the biggest takeaway I took away from the directory business is that, we had become commoditized so quickly, with being like such a key component to everybody's household, to being kind of an afterthought so quickly. The big difference around, the newspaper business and now kind of creeping into traditional media is that burn is slower, but it's very much the same. We've got a younger population that's grown up with technology at their fingertips, that have bypassed a lot of those pricing models, a lot of those things where these traditional companies made their money. How do we now adapt into being more content producers and monetize through traditional channels? And it's funny to even call the traditional channels, search and social, but that's what those channels are now.
Yeah. The atomization of content is very interesting, like the New York Times with their puzzle section and what you're doing on a per article or topical basis. What other sort of innovations in revenue models are you looking towards? Because, it seems like there's a lot of opportunity, and we've seen some publishers do this, is to lean into those particular strengths, the ones we sort of listed earlier, with sort of, alternative models, whether it be content marketing or sort of sponsored content on a like wider scale,
Yep.
or just other things like that. Where are you looking in terms of some of that revenue diversification and creativity?
So this is what has us most excited. We used to laugh. You used to sell squares on printed pages, and charge money as an advertisement. And then we started becoming very revolutionary and tech savvy and started selling squares on web pages as advertising, and came up with new ways to measure success, which were largely clicks and page views. That is so far in the rear view now, and I think for us as an industry, as content producers, there is a very exciting future for us. So I believe in the next 3 years, at least for us as a publishing company, we'll be deriving more revenue through commercial content, sponsored content, or custom content production than we will around traditional advertising. Display advertising is because this is the great misnomer that and if you talk to Google or Facebook or anybody else, they will say, listen, and they're not wrong, but they will say that if we're talking about a publishing company, we're passing them back 60 to 70 to 80% of their traffic for them to monetize. The reality is we're competing with those companies on display advertising, i.e., big boxes and skyscrapers, and we can't compete at scale. So it's diminishing returns, and there's just no business model there. But where we have a unique value prop is, again, our authority in content, our trust, the newsroom churning out what I would call the most important news within our community. And again, from our standpoint, these are manufactured wins. This is the unique value proposition that no one else can bring. And from our standpoint, that's where distribution becomes much more of a amplification model, which we expect to be paid for because it's going to benefit everybody. And that's where we're really leaning in. So I'll give you an example. One of the largest mental health hospitals in the world is here in Toronto. We did a tour at it's called CAMH. We did a tour yesterday and walked through, and we're going to be embarking on a partnership, telling their stories and talking about the evolution between what were insane asylums to now the very ethical and care of people that have, mental illness and substance abuse problems, and how that pivots. And those important stories are going to be told through the pages of our newspaper, but they'll be amplified, through digital media. And those stories don't get told if we're not here. And so for us, I think we have a very important platform, and we can do good and be good and offer things that no one else can offer. And we just need to really figure out that sweet spot. And it was lost for a while. We were competing on an unfair, playing field, and now, or an unbalanced playing field. And now, for us, really kind of honing in on where we know we can add value, and, really stopping, the commoditized part of our operation. It's hard to do. We just made the very tough decision to stop publishing a print product in our community markets. So as of 3 weeks ago, we had to say goodbye to a lot of our employee base, just because there was no business model left to publish community newspapers, which relied on flyer distribution, which has largely gone away. And we know that our future is going to be a digital footprint, and it's going to be around content creation. And, sometimes you're pushed to the wall to make those decisions, and it's a tough decision to make. But for us to survive, it's really going to be around the content we produce, not the advertising we sell.
Mm-hmm. Well, two quick reactions there regarding the sort of leaning into content marketing and sponsored content. One is that, and this goes back to the theme throughout this discussion of sort of leaning into newspaper strengths. There's no better entity out there to produce that, given the sort of the art of storytelling and the narratives. I mean, that's what newspapers do well. So I think that's a great sort of alignment of the strengths of your newsrooms that can be sort of deployed in these directions. And then number two, I'll mention another macro factor that relates back to some of the privacy reform we've seen over the last decade. One of the things being cracked down on the most is behavioral targeting online. And then, as you know, personalized targeting. So there's been this move back to contextual targeting, which is another thing that I think aligns with what newspapers can do, in that the targeting is about the content on the page or its adjacency, as opposed to, details about the actual user and what they've done in the last 30 things they've clicked on. So I think both of those factors very much sort of support the direction you're going in.
Yeah, it's ad tech has been a wonderful and a damning thing for our industry. I think, if you look at it, I think, 30 to 40% of states now, have lawsuits against Meta and other social channels, just around some of the targeting you're talking about, that it's intrusive, and against, especially against our youth, or towards our youth. And that is scary. Contextual targeting has always been a major strength of ours. I think where we've started to fall down, and I think this is largely a local media driven phenomenon, is everyone's forgotten about the top of the marketing funnel. And we started to become so reliant and so enamored with, what I would call those attribution tactics, which could be, click path and path to purchase. And what people forget is, yes, Google is there when you're ready to buy. You typically don't call a plumber unless, you've got a leak or you've got a problem. So yes, Google has supplanted Yellow Pages as being, hey, I need a plumber now. Where that changes, though, how did that brand name, or how did that reputability of that plumber, how did you make that decision? And unfortunately, that top of the funnel piece, where traditional media has largely played, a role, was forgotten, and we all started to dive into kind of that attribution piece. I can tell you, contextual marketing now has made a massive resurgence. Whether we're dealing with local credit unions or big banks, they want to be affiliated with reputable content around, savings, or first-time mortgages, or how to budget during, tough economic times. Whatever those things are, contextual's made a major comeback, and And the good thing is that's one thing we can offer at scale. And so, like I said off the top, like I think we all have a role to play in that marketing funnel. Um, and from a local advertising perspective, you know, it's sometimes hard to decipher, what tactics you should be using. And I think, the big change, I guess, since I left um, the directory business is it's just there's so much competition out there. There's so many resellers of AdWords and social media and how do they figure out their own mix and how do they figure out what's going to work. And I think all of that coming together and all of us working together at some point becomes imperative for these local advertisers, because I would hate to open a shop in my local market on the corner and try and figure out how do I get people to come into this place. It's so diluted and so confusing.
So, sort of winding down here, based on the trajectory of everything that we've been discussing, where do you foresee the newspaper industry being in the next 5 years? And then where does Torstar sort of sit in that ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's been, waiting for our disappearance for some time. I think the models in the past said, by 2010, newspapers would be extinct, and obviously, when you look at companies like the New York Times that have 3x the digital subscribers they do in print, there is hope there. I don't think you're going to see a resurgence of newspaper advertising. I'm not delusional in that fact. We're lucky that we've been, at least on the daily newspaper side, fairly stable. I would say the Toronto Star is probably one of the top performing newspapers from stability in North America. But I think the pivot point is exactly what we talked about. I think we start to become much more content producers versus distribution experts. So I do believe you'll start to see retraction in the print product. This has been going on for 2 decades, where you're seeing publications starting to go to fewer days of the week or going digital only. I don't think the model is there, at least for community newspapers or daily newspapers serving cities. National newspapers are a little different. We still need to figure out that sweet spot, but I firmly believe the future is around content production, distribution deals with big tech, and then a premium product where we can derive subscription revenue to people that want to call it lean back, enjoy, and delve into news as a part of their daily routine. It's not for everybody. You have to offer news at scale to people that want breaking news, but I also believe there's a space for a premium product with a higher price point, almost as a luxury brand.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So that's actually all the time we have, and we can end it there. But I want to thank you, Brandon, for joining us. This has been very enlightening.
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it, and thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening. This has been This Week in Local. Stay tuned every week for more episodes. You can find the show on all major podcast networks and find out more at Localogy.com. So please subscribe, like, and comment. Your engagement helps others find us. So I'm Mike Boland. My co-host is Charles Laughlin. Our producer is Dara Sweat. And this week's guest has been Brandon Grosvenor. You can find out more about Brandon and Torstar in the show notes. So thanks for listening and see you next week.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Localogy's This Week in Local with Mike Boland and Charles Laughlin. Be sure to subscribe for more.